welcome to History in Lowell. My name's Maritza Grooms and I'm here with my buddy, Bob Forrant.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Today we're going to take you 100 years back in time, a little bit more, but to something that is unfortunately timely and relevant. We're living in a time of a global pandemic, and we haven't seen anything like this since maybe 1918, 1919, 1920. Well, let's get into it, Bob.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's striking. Teaching American history for as many years as I have, I would gloss over the 1918 to 20 influenza, as it was called, or the grip. Another word for it was the grip, G-R-I-P-P-E. And around Lowell, if you were French Canadian, you might have been calling it the grip. And I never knew, like one of my grandparents, when I would get a stomachache, would say, oh, he's got the grip. And I never made any association until I started thinking about this. But in teaching this past spring, I thought, okay, well, I need to get into this a bit more. Maybe I should do more than 15 minutes because, you know, it's just here and the students are sitting and living through it and maybe some context. And so that's what prompted me to do a lot more investigation than I would normally do about a disease. I mean, I think of myself as a historian, not a disease expert. But fortunately, there are a number of books and things that you can read that break it down into more or less unmedical terminology so that even me can get it. Even I can get it, I should say. And so here we are.
Yes. So we definitely did one episode about the 1918 influenza last year, but that was more on a global scale or a national scale. And we're going to kind of bring it back to home as we do and talk about Lowell and the surrounding areas and how they were impacted. So where should we begin? You sent me some really interesting things, Bob. Some of these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that I think troubled lots of us in the current pandemic is the ways in which people came up with all these weird cures for things that you could do, like light bulbs and fluorescent light and, you know, less toil or whatever the hell people were drinking, or Lysol, or, you know, all these crazy things that people were coming up with, right? And as I started doing this work, that was one thing I found that was in local newspapers as well as national, as well as European newspapers. So that might be an interesting place to sort of ease our way into it. The extent to which people tried to take products that were irrelevant to actually figuring out a way to deal with the influenza, but somehow these were the miracle cures.
Oh, there's always a miracle cure for every generation. I know for this one, a lot of people were saying vitamin D. Maybe you just need to eat some more fruits and veggies. Back then, it was onions.
Yeah, there was an ad I found for this farm this was an ad from a newspaper in the Midwest. And the argument was that this guy made in the ad was, if you eat a raw onion every day, it will keep the influenza away, sort of like an apple a day, only this was an onion a day. And so there's an ad in a newspaper that this particular farmer is bringing a whole boxcar full of onions into town on a Saturday, and people can come and load up. And it's really funny because in the ad it also says, make sure that you bring your own bag or basket to take away your onions, that he's not providing anything for you to carry them away, but a trainload of onions are going to pull into town. There's no follow-up, right? I mean, I did not find anything that linked a cure to eating onions, but it was one of these things that and in my class, my students got like, they were like, oh, like raw, yeah, I said, anybody want to try? I brought an onion in on that particular day, and I asked if anybody wanted to try it, and I got no take. I almost did it just for the goof of it, but I didn't.
I wonder how many people back then were walking around eating onions. Yeah. What a smell.
Would keep people away.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess, I mean, that would, maybe that would be how it would work. I don't know.
Oh, you know, there is something to the social distancing. I'd probably stay away from someone who smelled too much of onions. Yeah. And I know that they were also having similar issues that we had about their masks. People not wearing masks, people being anti-maskers, having whole meetings and creating groups about it. People felt that their constitutional rights were violated. We've heard a lot of that rhetoric even now, but 100 years ago we were hearing the same things. I think I saw one of those posts that were mask slackers. That's what we called anti-maskers back then, and I think I want to bring that back. Mask slackers. I like the ads out or the things that in my mind I think of it as a post because we live in a social media age. But
right. Well, they were posters.
Yeah, exactly.
So there would, I mean, there was a really strong media campaign, particularly in big cities. So like public health officials in New York or Boston or San Francisco, what have you, Chicago would plaster the trolley cars and places where people would be in, train stations, post offices, with these posters which showed people wearing masks and social distancing. If you got to sneeze, cover your face, all this sort of stuff. And they were really trying to push it. And so this was a concerted effort. But as you say, parallel to it there was an organization that was nationwide called the Anti-Mask League. And this organized chapters in different cities around the United States. One of the largest ones was in San Francisco. And in San Francisco, they passed ordinances in the city that public health officials could arrest people if they were on the street or if they tried to get on a trolley and they weren't wearing a mask. And so this led to confrontations. I did find an article where a public health official in San Francisco who was armed tried to by gunpoint arrest somebody not wearing a mask, and they got into a tussle and the gun went off and 3 people were shot. Nobody was killed, but 3 people were shot. And so these things happened quite a bit around the country during this period of time. But again, for me, what I was noticing is the link between these 2 100-year apart incidences is that people back then understood keeping social distance, wearing a mask would be useful. It took us a long time to get to that point in this particular situation, and then we also had the same sort of resistance, opposition to it. And so we didn't learn from that earlier period that this was effective. And in Lowell and in Lawrence, one of the things that happened in the mills is a lot of the mills turned over to actually making masks because there were mask shortages. And so I found a photo of a mask that's in the Lawrence History Center that was made in one of the mills in Lawrence out of fabric from the Lawrence Mill. And we did that too as well, right? I mean, there was a lot of, in the beginning, no masks in what we're going through right now, and people even built their own little cottage industry at home making masks for their friends out of whatever could work. And so mask shortages back then, mask shortages now, all of this, and this is again going on in Lawrence and Lowell. I read a lot of the newspapers from both cities to try to figure out how to make it a more local conversation with my students and now obviously with our audience.
Of course. One thing I did find interesting too about the mask were people were fined. That did not happen this time around. And I'm curious about your opinion on that. Why do you think that we didn't fine people for not wearing a mask?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, it's definitely the case in everything I found that it was like a ticket. You would be issued a ticket. I don't know. I haven't been able to figure out whether actually 100% everybody paid it,
right,
or whether people just sort of like with traffic tickets. And then you find out now when you go to the registry to try to renew your license, and they say, "Oh, you have 88 tickets. Sorry, you can't renew." But definitely there were mandates to wear the mask and to be fined. There would be people on the trolleys in Boston, New York, San Francisco, other places where I've looked, who would prevent you from getting on the trolley. They would stand there, and if you didn't have a mask on, they would be like at the doorway of the trolley, and they would keep you off. They would physically try to block you. And so I'm sure that led to a lot of physical sorts of confrontations during that period of time. I do think, though, that because we're so much in a more connected age, that these things spread far more quickly. And so like people resisting masks then becomes, a tweet, then becomes Instagram, then becomes TikTok. How do I know all these things? And then at the end of the day, right, there's like 88,000 people watching somebody in Lowell, not get on the trolley without wearing their mask, right? I mean, it didn't happen as much back then, so it's not as fluid a movement per se. They also had, which I found really fascinating, lots of colleges that didn't close held their classes outside. And so I found photographs of classes in Montana in the winter.
Wow.
And people are outside in the snow, sitting on bleachers like at a football stadium or, you know, whatever it would be. And, you know, and you could see the teacher, everybody's all bundled up with hats and scarves and mittens, and they're having outside class. Courts would be held. In San Francisco, they held the court outside on most days while all this was going on. They didn't stop the court, they had it outside. So I guess that's the equivalent of Zoom.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the 1918 version of 2020 Zoom.
Oh, wow. Wow. I couldn't even imagine. Could you imagine being outside with your students in the wintertime?
No, I mean, I actually like it in the spring, right? When it's the first nice day and everybody says, oh, can we go out? It's kind of like a treat, right? But no, not in January in Lowell. I don't know what, I mean, if it was, I should stop and think though, if it was that or Zoom,
I know, you're very much an in-person person.
I might go for I might go for outside.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, you know, I think about how the media played a huge role back then in spreading information, the same way that the media does today. And I find it interesting that even back then, how we had all of the PSAs today about washing your hands and how germs spread, but there were also things like that back then as well. And let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll shift gears just a little bit. Yeah,
I mean, there were ads, again, for interesting ads for products that still are around. There were ads all the time for Lysol, Lysol spray, that would help kill the virus back in 1918. Also, Lifebuoy soap. There are a huge amount of ads in magazines and newspapers, and there's usually an ad about washing your hands when you come home from work or whatever, and use Lifebuoy soap. And so these household commodities, again, are trying to figure out. There's also ads a lot for, I forget the name of it, but there's some kind of mint, breath mint, that keeps advertising itself as if you take these mints. This will keep you from this won't cure you, but it will keep you from getting sick. So there's definitely a lot of, there's also, which I found fascinating, there was an ad for in a New York newspaper ad for a shoe company that said that one of the ways to not get the influenza in 1918 was to have dry feet. And the way to have dry feet was to buy this particular brand of shoes that they sold in their shoe store. So people were grappling with and grasping anything as a way. Obviously, probably the businesses were suffering. People weren't out shopping as much. There was not a lot of close downs of stores like we've just gone through, but definitely there were other sort of moves to shut things down as well.
Right. So let's get into the not so fun side of this, the public health aspect and who it impacts and how this even spread to begin with. We know that we were fighting a different kind of war at that time, and it definitely impacted the local area and surrounding areas. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so again, sort of the important linkage here is the First World War. And so in actuality, the influenza, most historians and medical researchers and whatnot agree that the influenza actually started in the United States. And most likely it started in Kansas on a farm. And it was conveyed between animals and people. And it spread. And that what happened was that as we were ramping up for the U.S. to enter the First World War, young men from all around the country were going to Kansas for military training or other military installations around the country. Fort Devens near Lowell, out Route 2, heading out, you know, towards Gardner, Athol, Fitchburg, that way from Lowell. And so people brought it with them. And so people would be sick, and then they would end up in close quarters in barracks and in training and hand-to-hand combat fighting, whatever it would be, before they would go to Europe. And then they would also get on the troop ships to go to Europe, and some of them would be ill. And then when they would get to Europe, which again I didn't realize until I started doing more research, huge numbers of troops would end up in hospital, dying of the influenza and never actually making the battlefield. And then that spread it to the rest of Europe, that people were going into fighting and in close quarters again, and that's how it spread pretty dramatically, fairly quickly, between the beginning of 1918 and the first part of 1919.
But it wasn't called the American flu. It was called the Spanish flu.
It was called the Spanish influenza, which is, when I taught it, that's the way I always talked about it. And again, then sort of the necessity of trying to think more clearly and deeply about this, I did more work. And it turned out that Spain was neutral during the First World War, what we were just speaking about a second ago. And so Spain was writing about what was happening, that people were getting sick, that this was a disease they weren't quite sure of, but they knew it was highly contagious, and wear masks and do all these sorts of things. And they were writing about it all the time. And so people inferred from that it started there. Whereas in the US and in other European capitals as well, there were actually bans on people writing about, publicly talking about the influenza. And in the United States, when the war started, there was an Espionage Act and a Sedition Act passed in Congress to try to prevent spying and speaking badly about the country during the war, to control speech that anybody might make against the war. And one of the things that was included was talking about people being sick. That if you talked about being sick and you talked about the scale and scope of it, it would give aid and comfort to the enemy, and at the same time discourage people in the United States. And so President Wilson never once, which again, fascinating, never once during this period from 16, 17, 17 especially as it's starting, through his time in office, never once uttered the words influenza. He never actually warned people, publicly talked about it throughout the duration of his administration.
Even though he contracted it twice, right?
Yeah. Even though he was really sick twice, and people think in 1920 when he went to Europe to try to create the League of Nations, to sort of the earlier version of what becomes the United Nations, that he got really ill, and people think that he became really incapacitated and couldn't really function that well at that conference. And then he came back and he sort of disappeared from view for the rest of his time in office in the tail end of 1920. So, when I was talking about that with my students, I said it's really interesting that now we have two presidents that sort of were living through something, but were pretending somehow it wasn't there, or it wasn't as big of a deal, or denying the reality of what everybody else could see. And it reminded me of Ronald Reagan when he was president. HIV/AIDS was really escalating, and he never once wanted to actually talk about that from the Oval Office. He only mentioned it really at the very tail end of his administration, as opposed to pushing for research and developing ways to deal with HIV/AIDS and trying to figure out a public health sort of attack on the illness. And so it's strange to me how you get somebody in like that, again, sort of Wilson, Reagan, and then Trump. And so there's three. Wilson's a Democrat, and the other two are obviously Republicans. But it didn't matter about the party per se. It was just this denial of reality.
Right, and that definitely had a negative impact, and we saw that in Lowell, Lawrence, Worcester, and surrounding areas. And I think that from what I've read, we didn't really even start reporting on it until those cases hit us at home.
Yeah, I mean, it's not until like late September, early October of 1918, even though this has been going on since like November, December of 1917, not huge numbers of cases, but nonetheless cases. And even as late as in the fall of 1918, I found an article in one of the Lowell newspapers that talks about, so Devens is not that far, Fort Devens is not that far away from Lowell, and on for weekend passes, lots of the people that were in training at Devens would come to Lowell because there were bars and whatnot, entertainment. And so there's an article that talks about how, well, there's just a few cases. There's some cases at Devens, and people are sick. A few people have died, but it's really not that big a deal, so everybody's still going to come to Lowell for the weekend. This is in late September. And then by the beginning of October, the cases now, the Lowell Public Health is talking about 250 cases this week, then 400 cases then 600 cases, and then the city council is wrestling with whether to close schools. The state's wrestling with whether, because this is escalating across Massachusetts by this point, should we close churches? Should we close bars? What are we going to do? And now we're in the same sort of conversation in late 1918 that obviously we were here in early 2020. What do we do? How do we try to stop the spread? That becomes a politically charged issue in Lawrence and Lowell and Andover. Things get so bad that in Lawrence the federal government comes in and builds a military-style hospital, outdoor hospital with tents to care for the escalating numbers of sick people because there's not enough room in the hospitals to take care of people. And again, that goes from like not talking about it at all in early September to in the middle of October, we don't have enough beds. I mean, that's how quick.
Oh my goodness. And then of course the same thing that happened in 2020 and that's still unfortunately happening. The frontline workers get hit super hard and we start losing nurses and others who are taking care of those folks.
Yep.
Oh,
there's nursing shortages, there's mask shortages, people don't have the ability to mask up, and factories are not closing. The ways in which a lot of workplaces shut down in 2020 didn't happen back then. And again, it becomes very politically charged. Churches are told to close in October around here, around greater Lowell area, and lots of churches say, no, you can't tell us. Separation of church and state, you can't tell us what to do. We're going to stay open. Catholic churches especially just decline closing. Eventually some of them do, but not all do. Large parishes generally stay open. Schools close, then open, then close again. It's really, the interesting thing in Lowell is they debate whether they should close bars and package stores. And so for a while they say bars and package stores can stay open till, if I remember correctly, 6 p.m. Might be 5, but I think it's 6 p.m. And there's a big outcry. And so there's an article that I found in one of the papers about, in order to sort of deal with workers on their way home who need a drink or whatever to relieve the day, we need to keep the bars and the package stores open an extra hour. So they keep them open a little bit longer in order to sort of assuage that part of the population. And so it goes back and forth, back and forth. One week the city council's for shutting things down. A couple weeks later the cases go down a little bit and then let's reopen as quickly as we can. Then there's another spike and you can see it just exactly like we're going through now, where we've had these 3 or 4 waves, right? Where it's a spike, we shelter, we do what we're doing, cases lessen, and then we say, oh good, open up again, then another spike. The same thing has happened exactly between 1918 and 1920. You can document at every moment where they relax masks and distancing in that early period, and then there's a spike. It's just, you overlay them and they're perfect.
And they didn't have a vaccination like we.
And they didn't have a vaccination.
Yeah. That other really bad wave came when the war ended and people were out celebrating and they forgot about what was going on here. I think one of the most devastating facts about it is how many people we lost in the war and due to the flu, and how eerily relevant that is to today.
Yeah, I mean, more people passed from the influenza than from the fighting in the war. And the war's ending caused the most severe spike for a couple of reasons. One is that people were coming back from Europe on troop ships, thousands and thousands of soldiers, and many of them were infected and had been infected in Europe and had been in hospital or whatever, but now were on troop ships coming back. And when they came back, so Boston was one of the staging areas where big troop ships let people out. And so these ships are coming and people are getting off, they're hugging their relatives, they're going out to eat, they're doing all these things that one would normally expect to do after 2 years or a year and a half away. And then all of a sudden people begin to notice in Boston, public health officials, whoa, there's these upticks. And as well, people are coming to Boston, but then they live in Worcester or they live in, you know, Rutland, Vermont, or they live in Manchester, New Hampshire, and so they're leaving and going there, and then there's these little isolated, you know, like, what, I don't know what we call them now, but little spikes or whatever. And so people think, okay, and so then there's a period of time once that connection is made where when people come back from the war, they're not let out into the public. They're actually put on trains and they're sent to Devens, the very place where they would have been trained initially to go fight, and they're confined there for 2 weeks to see if they show any symptoms before they can be let out. And about 25, somewhere between 25 and 30% of everybody that goes there ends up dying.
Oh my God.
So that's how much illness is coming back. And so, yeah, it's the parallels are really striking. And the willingness or not to socially distance, to wear masks, to do all these other sorts of things. And we have even better, obvious scientific medical technologies now. We have better ways to collect data and understand these spikes and things than people did back then. But we're not faring any better.
Yeah, the number right now for us presently is upwards of about 600,000, right?
Yeah, it's like I looked just before I came, it's 608,000 as of today, and overall back then it was 675,000.
Wow.
Total, and so we've not run our course yet. So it'll probably be something somewhat comparable. The cases are around the same. There's about 34 million cases in the U.S. between 1918 and 1920. There's right now about 35 million cases over time in the U.S. So the numbers are fairly similar. Worldwide, there were 500 million cases.
Wow.
And 50 million deaths worldwide.
Oh my goodness.
But right now in the U.S., we are in first place, right? Thinking of the Olympics, and we're in first place in COVID deaths. And again, it's striking that we're this country that prides itself on its science and its medicine and its research universities and research hospitals. And these figures, when I started putting them together, are so strikingly similar. You would think this time we would have done a far, far better job. But we didn't learn the lessons from the earlier one.
Well, I feel like that's as good a place to end as any. We continuously find on this show that we do not learn from history.
Yeah, I know. What am I doing? What am I doing wrong?
We're trying to help. We're trying to help. Please learn from this, folks. You know, there's plenty of books on this that you can read. You can watch this show and hopefully make better choices going forward. You know, let's just care about our fellow human.
Yeah. Pretty simple.
You know, it really would seem so.
Yep.
Thank you, Bob, for bringing that history forward and really sharpening the lens for us in terms of Lowell and the surrounding areas. But I really hope that we learn from this and we don't have a repeat of this in the next 100 years.
Yeah, 50 years from now, if we're doing this, I won't be around, but you can write the history.
I will, and we'll have this as a testament to,
yeah, right.
to that moment.
Yep, there we go. We can save this tape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you all for tuning in. Hopefully you've learned something today. This has been History in Lowell.